Welcome to the Ghost Show online, my fiends, booze, and ghouls. Your hosts, Seika Groves, Rachel Benter, and Ian Russell will discuss all things paranormal. Prepare to be afraid.
Okay, the very first forensic work that had been undertaken with the Franklin expedition was done by Dr. Owen Beatty, who was a forensic anthropologist at the University of Alberta. And he started his work back in 1981. And he went to King William Island to try to find bones and any artifacts that he could from this trek that the Franklin crew members made. And he was able to recover some bones, and he found absolutely telltale marks on the bones that related to cannibalism. So those stories were true. And even more interesting is the enhanced level of lead, exactly, in those bones compared to the Inuit people at the time. So what Dr. Beatty did was he turned his attention then to the little cemetery on Beechy Island and the three graves of the Franklin seamen. And what Beatty did is that he applied for permission to open the graves and autopsy the bodies. And it was a very complex process, I can imagine. Yeah. And it wasn't until 1984 that he was actually granted permission to go ahead and exhume these bodies. The bodies were completely encased in ice.
Sure, yes.
Once they reached them, that they had to warm up water or just melt the snow, because there was still snow on the ground.
Yes.
In the summer. Mm-hmm. And so they heated that up, used the warm water to slowly melt the ice off the body. And the very first one that they decided to exhume was a stoker on one of the ships. His name was John Torrington. Yeah, they dug down, thawed the ice after opening the coffin, and the body was amazingly preserved.
I know.
The tissue, the clothing. Owen Beatty and his scientific team, they autopsied the body, and yes, there were high levels of lead, as we suspect, and there was also evidence that John Torrington had died from pneumonia related to symptoms of tuberculosis.
Right. Another common, ailment at that time that could easily sweep through a crew, because if one person has it, if you have not built up an immunity, because tuberculosis is one of those strange things like smallpox. Some people could survive and build up a certain amount of immunity, and they may not be affected by it in the future. But on board ship, tuberculosis, smallpox, these types of things were, generally a huge problem. So I did see that in some of the research that, they had underlying health problems, and obviously stemming from, being on board for better part of 3 years in a climate that none of them were, really prepared for. Even
Yeah.
clothing, they weren't really prepared for it clothing wise either, not for long term.
But remember, these three were deceased in that first winter.
That's right. Yes.
So after exhuming John Torrington, Dr. Beatty then went and they exhumed John Hartnell and William Brain, were the other two sea crew members. And exactly the same results: high lead levels, pneumonia, and tuberculosis.
Yeah. Which is probably what killed them, was the tuberculosis prior to the lead poisoning. And
Right.
I mean, even though they have very high levels of lead in their body because they had been eating these tinned foods for the better part of a year, the tuberculosis is likely what killed them. And, probably all around the same time as well. It looks like from how the bodies were buried, and that it was a very short time period. So it may.
Yes, it was. John Torrington died on January the 1st, 1846. John Hartnell died 3 days later on January the 4th.
Right.
And William Brain died on April the 3rd.
Okay.
Of that same year. So they were all very, very close together in the times of their death.
Especially the first two. And that goes to show you that they were staying in that location for an extended period of time. And then when the third person passed away, I suspect that the remaining crew were sort of like, this is not good and we need to get out of here. The rest of them did not really want to succumb to tuberculosis, and they would have been aware of what it was at that time. It wasn't a mystery disease, but it's interesting to see, how things progressed and how chaotic it became after that, even more so. I mean, there's actual burials taking place. There is a certain amount of coherence still amongst the remainder of the crew, but it does, at some point, the scale just tips and everything goes
right.
Everything goes
right.
And when we start to see these signs of cannibalism, we know that there isn't any food available anymore, or they've at some point realized that eating this tinned food is doing them in. But what's so interesting too is when you think about, there was probably an abundance of seal, and applying it to the situation. Like, I understand there was some notes written in some of the logs, and I don't know that it was Franklin himself. It may have been a first mate that did talk about, hunting seal, but they were not effective at it. They did not know how to properly hunt the seal, and they were afraid to waste their ammunition trying to hunt seal. So instead, they just gave up, and it just seems like it was doomed from the get-go that, even though Franklin had planned this and he had been on previous expeditions, it boggles the mind that you do not take advantage of local people in a community in the Arctic to at least get pointers on what to do if you get stuck there, right? These people live off the land, know it better than anybody else in the world, yet you're almost refusing to comprehend this.
I think that was part of the problem, that because Franklin had led expeditions prior to this that they didn't expect to perhaps get stuck in that ice like they did.
Right.
And who knew that in that second winter there would be no thaw? Except,
again, local people would have been able to tell you about the conditions. They were so aware of their surroundings, right? And I mean, we see this over and over in history. Again and again and again. It doesn't matter, whether it's the Mayflower landing or, people in Jamestown, Virginia, or all of these early colonizers who for some reason just didn't catch a clue on, respecting and understanding that the people who had lived here for thousands and thousands of years probably knew better. But you end up with these kind of situations. So ultimately,
and so that is the history of the, as I say, I won't call it the lost Franklin expedition, because in modern history, the story has come to a close when both of the ships were discovered.
Right, 2000.
Finally, after all these years of searching, the Erebus was found in 2014, and then the Terror was found 2016.
Right. And which was an amazing find unto itself as well, is to be able to, but that again, we have global warming to thank for being, able to find all of these things. Global warming, not. But again, it's an interesting story. So during all of this chaos of the crew, spending 3 years trapped in the Arctic, essentially, we have the flip side of this. And this is what is going on back home in England when they sort of realize they're missing, right? It's really interesting because it becomes a paranormal story. And while there are some interesting aspects to the voyage itself, what happens on the flip side of this, I think, is actually even more interesting, because it becomes really bizarre in terms of what happens. So just to touch on this, because I want to get into one story in particular, right? But we have this idea of course, now this place where these two ships went down, that obviously ghosts of the crew of the Erebus and the Terror perhaps are wandering aimlessly around this area in the Arctic. We also have, if you haven't seen, I don't know if you've seen this, Ian, but I think I was talking about it. There's a really, really good AMC series called The Terror, and it was based on a book by Dan Simmons, and it is fictional yet has elements of nonfiction in it. So it's based on the Terror itself, and it's called The Terror, and it's a really, really interesting supernatural concept that was based on some Inuit, I hate to use the word folklore because it's only folklore to those of us who don't believe it, but the Inuit spirits that are actually on the land. And so there's a very interesting approach of one of these Inuit spirits in this series. And I don't want to give it away because it's really worth watching just to see it. But then we get into things like in the UK. So now we're back home, and we start to see something come up where Franklin's wife is now, curious, wondering what has happened, where has her husband gone? And it's been a long time. And so she actually starts to seek out the help of clairvoyants, seers, mediums, psychics, whatever you want to call them. And I find it really interesting that of that, comes this whole other dimension to this story.
Yeah, and this is a side of the story that I'm sure many do not know about.
And
I myself have never heard any of this before, so you're going to be educating me
yeah,
as
and
well as everyone else who's not aware of this.
so this is a really interesting side of the story, as I said, because it is so, I mean, we might think of it as unusual today, but we know that in the mid 1800s, for the most part, those of us who care to know, that, you know, the idea of occultism, New Age, spiritualism had found a pretty good footing in everyday life. And so we have this interesting story stemming from Lady Jane Franklin herself. She lobbies the Admiralty to investigate, obviously, her husband's disappearance and locating the missing vessels. So in 1850 now, we don't know what happened to the ships. She doesn't know what happened to the ships, but she's desperate and she wants a lead. She wants to know where her husband is. So she actually meets this gentleman whose name is William Coppin, and Coppin is a shipbuilder. And around this time, how she met him was that he sent her a letter. And in this letter, he says that a ghost of his daughter said that she knew where to find the Franklin expedition. So Coppin's daughter's ghost has come forward to speak. Now, Coppin has a number of children, and he has another daughter named Anne, who is older, and Anne has claimed to see these blue orbs, or at least a blue orb, that she believes is her little sister. So her little sister's name was Louisa, and this is where the story gets really interesting, because Louisa was known as Wheezy for short. The young girl was only 3 years old. She died of gastric fever. So at that time period, not unheard of. Children were lucky if they made it to 5. So little Wheezy dies. So soon after her death, this is when her siblings start reporting that they're seeing this orb that's visiting them in their bedroom. Again, perhaps not so odd. But what becomes really odd is that Wheezy's older sister tells her aunt that Mr. McKay is dead. And her aunt, doesn't really know what to think of this. And interestingly enough, the aunt can't physically see these orbs, but the other sisters and brother can see the orbs. So we have a 3-year-old child ghost telling her siblings and her aunt about the passing of Mr. McKay. Very unusual. What gets more strange is weeks later, the aunt actually suggests that the children use Wheezy's apparent abilities of clairvoyance to start talking about the fate of the Franklin expedition. Because, of course, this is on everybody's lips at this time. It's in the newspapers. It's everywhere.
Right.
This is not something that's just, fallen by the wayside. So we now have, apparently, according to the family sources, that Wheezy responds to this question. And the people in the room can sort of subconsciously see an Arctic scene that's got 2 ships with snowy hills in the background and narrow channels. And when they ask the question if Franklin is alive, Wheezy actually reveals a description of a round-faced man in the mist waving his hat. And she says, there's a series of abbreviations. So this is all coming from the ghost. Okay. This is not something, this is supposedly coming from the ghost. So the ghost of this 3-year-old child. Now we get abbreviations. So there are the letters P.R.I. and then the letters BS dot. So odd from a 3-year-old, because honestly, most 3-year-olds probably couldn't read, write, or, but yet this is supposedly coming from a 3-year-old child. So we again have more of these sort of illuminations from this 3-year-old. And what happens is she sort of goes on to tell her sister, Anne, who's going to write them down at this point now, and her father is away, but she's going to show her father what's going on. And Coppin, again, this is Coppin's children, so the shipbuilder, that there's all this information on this missing Franklin expedition. Now, Coppin comes home, he's thinking, maybe my kids are just, whatever they're doing, maybe they're having some fun, maybe they're pulling my leg, maybe they're just, imagining this. But he hears about Lady Jane actually preparing to send out, as you said, the ship was the Investigator.
The Investigator was one of them, yeah.
So this is one of the ships. So he writes her this letter detailing what his dead toddler daughter has said. So now the abbreviations he puts in the letter, that he believes that the abbreviations mean Prince Regent Inlet off Barrow Strait. So PRI and BS, Prince Regent Inlet and Barrow Strait. And then goes on to say likely in the Victory in Felix Harbor, not far from it at this moment. And Lady Jane doesn't really know what to think of this, but she actually directs the commander of this investigative ship, the Investigator, or whichever one it was, because it's not telling us exactly, to meet and to actually diverge their intentional route from north to south, because this area is in the south. So this is where the story sort of starts to come off the rails, so to speak, in a weird kind of way. Because now we get this weird interjection from a reverend named J. Henry Screws, who publishes a book at Coppin's behest. So Coppin has essentially taken all the stories of Wheezy, his little dead deceased daughter, and he wants to put this all into a book. But this vision causes Lady Jane to point her expedition again into the direction of Prince Regent Inlet. And so we now have this whole concept of looking for somebody who has been missing based on the information provided by a 3-year-old spirit who would have no knowledge of this event. She passed away before anything has been announced. Right. So what do you think about that part of it so far?
It's bizarre.
Isn't it?
It's the only word I can come up with is bizarre.
It's really, really unusual. Now, even if they were to fake this, how would they know? Because apparently there were no reports of this location to date of Franklin having been there. So it gets even weirder, because now, according to Coppin, his daughter, Wheezy, has illuminated the words Erebus and Terror. So she's named the ships. And Sir John Franklin, Lancaster Sound, Prince Regent Inlet, Point Victory, and Victoria Channel. So at that point, there is no place named Victoria Channel, but yet this is all coming out from this spiritual interaction. So Coppins is collaborating with Skews at this point to write this book, but they really aren't keen on publishing it because Lady Jane is still alive. But the initial thing that's interesting is in Coppin's letter to Lady Jane, he didn't mention Victoria Channel at that time. Apparently this information came out after. So Lady Jane herself instructs Coppin to share Wheezy's vision with a few influential, I can't even speak, influential figures. So now we have this story spreading beyond Coppin, and Lady, herself, Franklin, is asking people to take this into consideration as, something that might possibly be an answer to where her husband has gone. So, as you mentioned, this ship arrives, but they can't get into the inlet because it's frozen. And this is Foresight. And actually, this schooner is known as the Prince Albert. So this is another schooner that was sent out. But Foresight actually broke the news that they had located the 3 graves on Beechy Island. So there's the tie-in with your historical side of things, right? Is this discovery of these graves. They find them with this expedition. Even though they can't get through the pack ice, they do find these graves. And they do find an indication that Franklin and his men have probably journeyed further south, and but they don't know what's happened to him. So Lady Jane begins preparing another mission based on this information, and she gets a gentleman by the name of Captain William Kennedy to actually build a ship with the fundraising from Coppin, who's actually helping to build, and they're going to build this brand new ship, and they're going to go out and they're going to look. Now it gets even stranger because this is corroborated with Wheezy's account. Though Coppins has never seen these messages himself, and neither has Kennedy. But they both decide, based on this information, that this is a good idea. So independent of Lady Jane, the Hudson's Bay Company surveyor, John Ray, is actually making more progress. He's passed through the inlet now. It's 1851. And he comes to a narrow body of water that he christens Victoria Strait before encountering the ice and turning back. So Ray actually speaks with a local Inuit who reports having come across a few dozen white men on King William Island, not far from Victoria Strait. And he bought several English-made items from the Inuit who had these items in his possession, including a plate that had Sir John Franklin's name on it. So did the Inuit person just find these items? Probably, because as you said, they were trekking, carrying all of this stuff that made no sense. And as they were dying off, I guess it was just being left. So now Lady Jane directs her attention to King William Island and finances an expedition with another captain.
Thank you for watching The Ghost Show Online. Join your hosts again next week as they discuss more tales of the supernatural, the paranormal, and all things spectacular. See you soon.